So that anthem that our quartet sang was a song that I first became familiar with in my choir. We sang it in our fall concert. And we had the blessing of the composer. Elaine Hagenberg was actually at Lawrence University doing a workshop on composing, so she conducted our rehearsal and rehearsed us with that song one Sunday night. And I just was drawn by the lyrics. I didn't really understand much about it. And she told the story of the original hymn and George Matheson that wrote it. And then she said she was drawn to the lyrics, particularly those two verses, because in her concept, that's what the world is about. It's just driven and held up by love. And for her, God and love are synonymous. It's sort of the same thing and as vast as the universe. And I just kind of got drawn to that. For a number of reasons. First of all, like I said, the all-consuming, unrelenting love of God that it talks about. And it talks about it's part of an ocean. The depths, it was said, I give thee back the life I owe, that in thine ocean depths its flow. In my mind, the interpretation of it is, if I'm the recipient of this unending love that the universe gives me, I feel like I should give it back. And by giving it back, it then enriches the ocean of the love, and it just keeps going and keeps going. And I love that she uses this ocean metaphor in there, and that's one reason I grabbed this book, because it uses the same ocean metaphor, or the sky, or the mountains. It's just all these metaphors of something super, super big. So the final verse of it also, or the phrase of it, really attached my attention to, and it says, it says, and feel the promise is not in vain, that the morn shall tearless be. So the way I interpret that is that the joy of this love ultimately, hopefully, leads to a tearless morn. Frankly, a world where sadness and pain is mitigated by unrelenting love. So that's why you heard that song, that's why I've chosen that reading today. But the theme that I have going this month for the Soul Matters organization is mystery. So it's all ways to talk about that mystery of life and those things that can't be explained. And when I heard this song, I thought of Christian mysticism. And so I really wanted, because Oh Love is about Christian mysticism to me in a sense, that it's talking about this love and God's love being that encompassing. So first, a definition, so we all are on the same page with what Christian mysticism is. So from Encyclopedia Britannica. Mysticism is the sense of some form of contact with the divine or transcendent, often understood in Christian tradition as involving union with God. Mysticism played an important role in the history of Christian religion and emerged as a living influence even in modern times. So I'm intrigued by this Christian mysticism. I didn't know much about it until I got to seminary, and in seminary you're required to take a course in Christian history, of course. And you learn all about the early Christian church, and in the early days it was all about a community where they were taking care of each other, and it was radically inclusive and radically loving, and you had all these people that were beginning to create some rituals, but then you also had these people that were trying to live exactly the way some of the parts of the story of Jesus lived, where they'd go off in the desert and live off of practically nothing and have these visions of the divine. So these kind of characters were going on at the same time, and it all kind of merged together. And then in my mind, I actually wrote a paper on this, the Christian religion kind of took a wrong turn the second that Constantine decided to be, or was the emperor and decided to be Christian, and then Christianity became synonymous with the government and with the law and with the rules, and so then it became very doctrine-driven, and people had to adhere to certain doctrines, or it was off with your head and that kind of thing. So that's kind of the Christianity that we all know about, but as I was reading this textbook, I realized, well, wait a minute, I didn't really pay much attention growing up in Sunday school about all these Christian mystics and all these things that were happening simultaneously. It was almost like there was this dual path. Now, the mystics never were really well accepted until you get to the Middle Ages. So, ironically, at the same time that the Crusades are happening, which I can't think of anything that's more imperialistic than sending, Christian flag-driven troops to Jerusalem to retake the city, there was a guy named Bernard of Clairvaux. He lived from 1090 to 1153, and he was the first to really develop a theology of Christian mystical love, of divine love, and then actually write it down and publish it, and it became very widely known. Now, it's a fascinating thing because he had to ground everything in Bible verses and biblical studies, and so he chose the erotic wedding poetry from the Song of Songs, or the Song of Solomon's, or the Canticles, whatever tradition you come from, it's got different names. And this is how he developed the stages of unity with God, and this is how he thought about it. So, first, the soul had to kiss the feet of Christ to symbolize humility. Okay, that makes sense. You have to bow down. That makes sense. The second, the soul had to kiss the hands of Christ to symbolize a devotion to Christian virtue. And I mean, we don't normally do that anymore. We don't kiss presidents' hands and things like that. But back then, I see that. You know, you kissed the hand, proving that you were loyal to this monarch. And then lastly, it's a kiss on the mouth of Christ, symbolized an intimate encounter, one in spirit with Christ. Now, the author of this textbook had a sense of humor, and he goes, can you imagine? He's talking about this in elaborate sermons to a bunch of celibate monks. And so I'm sure it went over really well. But that's how he talked about the stages of love and this Christian mysticism. But then he went on. And Bernard got into, it was more like a science that he kind of wrote it all out, and writing down this passion of 4 types of love. So the first was love of self for the sake of self. So I think we can all imagine what that's all about. Self-preservation, making sure that you have a good ego. Love of God for the sake of self. To me, this gets into that space of if I don't love God, I'll probably be struck down by a bolt of lightning or end up in hell or something like that. And then the next, and these are hierarchical, the next one was love of God for the sake of God. So basically just really being into the religion and the spirituality of the faith. But then the last one, he says, is the love of everything, even the self, for the sake of God. And this was the highest form of love, where the self is completely subdued. And he talked about it being, that's the point at which you have deification, where you're in unity with God and completely consumed by this love. Well, that was Bernard of Clairvaux. He was a very intellectual guy, and as I read, there's a whole lot of other guys who wrote a lot of things like this. It was always this, here's a recipe for how you reach passionate mystic Christian mysticism. But none of them ever claimed that they actually had any personal experiences to talk about until you got to Hildegard of Bingen. So Hildegard of Bingen, I think, is pretty famous to a lot of folks. German nun who was the first woman, not the first woman that was into Christian mysticism by any means, but the first woman who was widely known about it and actually got the Pope's permission to publish, because women didn't have a lot of outlets back then. And so Bernard actually defended her in front of the Pope so that she could get permission to do this, because they didn't want a woman out there like being a heretic or something. So she described her personal experiences. She was a prolific writer, poet, and composer. She composed 77 hymns in the praise of God, and she has 3 volumes on her mystical revelations. And in her case, and I think I would really love this woman, because she emphasized spiritual sight and hearing when she had these personal experiences. So I'm a very visual person, and obviously I really like music a lot. This is a quote from her in one of her visions. She said, "Then I saw in the luminous sky in which I heard different kinds of music, marvelously embodying all the meanings I had heard before." So for Hildegard, her mystical theology was a spiritual experience of harmonious divine light and sound. And I like to think that our quartet tried to give you a little bit of that this morning. So if any of you had visions during it, please come after the service and tell me all about them. But no, we really wanted to try to do justice to that song. So that's all the beginning of Christianity and into the Middle Ages, but then there's modern Christian mysticism. Remember the Encyclopedia Britannica said that it's very much a strong presence in the modern day. So I kind of trace it back to Friedrich Schleiermacher. So also in seminary we got the joy of reading a lot of these German theologians, Immanuel Kant, Friedrich Schleiermacher, that kind of group. And Friedrich Schleiermacher is viewed, along with Kant, as the beginnings of liberal theology in a modern sense. So he was the early 19th century. He lived between 1768 and 1834. And at this point in time, there was a lot of movement towards getting away from pure doctrine, and that this is absolutely what you had to believe, and the church hierarchy, and the church as an institution, but coming up with a much more emotive way to do Christianity. And then they wrote a theology sort of around it to make it okay for everybody to do it. And so for Friedrich Schleiermacher, it was all, he said, okay, it's fine, there's church, there's all these things that you do on Sunday morning and during the week, but it means nothing if you haven't experienced it. In other words, you always hear the people who go to church on Sunday, but the way they live their lives during the week, you kind of wonder what they did on Sunday morning. His point was, no, it's not. Those rituals that you do on Sunday morning are just stepping stones into feeling a oneness with the divine and really seeking that. In fact, he got to the point where I'm not even sure that you need an institutional church to have Christianity. He was so far into the mysticism. And for him, the experience of faith superseded the doctrine of faith. Now he and Kant had a huge influence on the Transcendentalists. So for those of you that might be new to Unitarian Universalism, the Transcendentalists were a group of folks in America in the early like the first 3 decades of the 1800s. Most of them, almost all of them were Unitarian. Most of them were the children of Unitarian ministers, and they were like the flower children of the 19th century. So their parents had been part of the very wealthy, very hierarchical, very conservative and stuffy Unitarian church in Boston at the time and in New England, and they were rebelling. And they thought, Unitarianism has gone off the tracks. It's no better than Catholicism in the way that they're doing their ritual. We need to do something different. And so this was Walden Pond and all that kind of stuff, where they would get together and talk about their concept of the world was that nature, God, and humans were one. So that at the beginning of time they're all one, and when you're born on this earth, you're separated because you're born here, and so your purpose on earth is to try to seek to put it all back together again. And hence the Transcendentalists, and they didn't believe you had to go to church at all, so I don't know why I'm saying this to you all on a Sunday morning. But the whole point was you can go out in nature, you can go to Walden Pond, and you can find God there and commune with God there. So Friedrich Schleiermacher had a lot to say and heavily influenced these Transcendentalists that definitely led to our modern view of Unitarian Universalism. And as I was researching this, then I found a quote by Karl Rahner, another German, but 20th century Jesuit theologian. And he said this: "The Christian of the future will be a mystic or will not exist at all. Thus, Christian mysticism celebrates communing with God as the ultimate destiny of humankind, and that is everlasting life." So he was putting sort of this ultimate union with God here on earth on par with everlasting life, which I found very fascinating, that in the 20th century, mysticism had reached such a prominent place in Christian culture. Which leads me then sort of to the 21st century. And frankly, if you think about a lot of the charismatic movement that came out of it's been around for a long time, but it became very prominent in the back half of the 20th century and into the 21st century. You find a lot of mega churches that really are talking about having a personal relationship with God, usually through Jesus, and that's how they do it, and it all comes out of the same Christian mysticism. Now, you probably, I was talking to some of you earlier this week, you probably have a lot of friends who believe that that faith saved their lives. I've got a friend who, she told me she belongs to one of the mega churches in Appleton, and her marriage was falling apart, and her husband discovered this church, and it's a very much of a church that really promotes family and relationships with each other as well as with God, and it's a very emotive, and she just credits that with saving her marriage and probably saving her life. I know other people who've been through all kinds of addiction and oppression and abuse, and they find a lot of hope, and they pull themselves out of it with hanging on to a lot of Christian mysticism. So it's a very, very, very powerful thing that we have today, even in the 21st century. And so basically, Jesus is a metaphor for the unrelenting love of the universe, is how I see it. The same way that the book was talking about it. That wherever the little boy looked, you saw love as big as God itself. Modern Christian mysticism basically says Jesus is love, and then the mystics, or those who feel that pull, respond by in turn loving Jesus back. One thing kind of surprised me, another seminary story. I was in seminary for 6 years because I was doing it part-time while I was working, so I kind of saw, I guess I'll say, a generational break in it. So I went to Meadville Lombard in Chicago, which is historically one of the most humanist seminaries in the UUA. So religious humanism rules the day, and that's why I went there and how most of my peers, what they were about. But by the time I left, about year 5, there was suddenly a younger generation, I could have been their parent, who came in that were unabashedly Christian Unitarian Universalists and charismatic. So they believed very much in the spiritual and had no issue with it at all. And it really came to a fore for me when I was taking a class in the church in Tulsa, All Souls in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which is our largest Unitarian Universalist church. They have 3 services every Sunday. One is just like this. It looks and feels just like this. It's their biggest. They call it a transcendentalist service. I thought that was interesting. And then they have a little coffee hour, and then they break into 2 services that happen simultaneously. One is purely humanist, so they have some classical music and basically a really long sermon and not much else. And then one, because this congregation is that famous congregation that a Pentecostal African-American minister converted to Universalism and then brought his flock to join this church. It was full-on gospel. And I had never been in a Unitarian Universalist gospel service before. And it was fantastic. Praise band, the whole bit. It's 20 minutes of praise music because the preacher's doing the sermon and the humanist thing first time, has to run over to the other. And it's all in this one big massive building. So I was standing next to a friend of mine, and he, maybe because I'm old, maybe because I appear stodgy, I don't know, he goes, "Jim, I hope you don't mind, I pray like this. Is that okay?" I'm like, "Of course it's fine." And it just felt very comfortable in that environment. So it made me realize that this Christian mysticism isn't just something that's at a distance in some sort of mega church, that I've got a lot of friends from seminary who now are ordained and feel very comfortable having that be at least a part of their personal faith, if it's not necessarily a part of their congregational faith. So, this whole thing about mysticism, it's good. I don't see anybody sleeping yet. Because it's kind of a heady topic. So I wanted to make it more personal for you. And as I was researching this, I came across a passage in Gaia.com. And the title of it was 10 Telltale Signs You Might Be a Mystic. So this is what we're going to do today. I want you to think about whether you actually are a closeted mystic. So I'll read you the 10 things and I want you to think. The first, you value experience above all else. So like I've said, mystics tend to steer clear of strict doctrines and principles. That sounds very Unitarian Universalist to me. Number 2, you question existence. Why am I here? Why are we all here? I think we have a hymn that even asks that, right? So it seems pretty common for us. Number 3, you are comfortable with uncertainty. And so I think that's a characteristic of Unitarian Universalists, because we always say, we're here to question, and we might not even get the answers. But when I read how they described it, it kind of surprised me. It said, mystics understand that there is a plan behind every action in the universe, and therefore trust that every action has purpose, even if they don't know what the next moment will bring. So that's a little woo-woo. It's a little out there. So this is one of those things that it gets into the karma space. And I think we all have that, like something happens, and I will even say, the universe is telling me I don't need to be at that meeting because my car didn't start and there was a train in the way, and it's almost like me getting to the concert last night. So I think I have moments of that where I begin to believe that the universe is trying to tell me something. Number 4, you value intuition. Mystics rely on knowledge, language, and physical senses the same way as we all do, but their intuitive perceptions offer more deeper insight. So it's that I can think about this, I know, but something in my gut tells me I should do that instead. And if you go to the Myers-Briggs, I'm in that space. I'm often listening to my gut because it usually would have been the right answer had I followed it. Like, for example, I always argue with Siri that she doesn't know how to get me somewhere. That's one of those cases where I should have listened to Siri. The 5th one is you are uncomfortable with spiritual hierarchies. It says tenuous rituals and traditions have no place in the world of spirituality for mystics. They do not believe that there is only one path or correct way to experience divinity. That sounds very universalist to me. Number 6, you have your own set of rules. I love this one for this crowd in particular. Mystics feel a connection to every living thing and therefore are able to look beyond what may be socially acceptable. So I think that's a very hallmark of Unitarian Universalists. Number 7, you value internal growth. To mystics, rituals and traditions are meant to trigger internal insight and transformation, not to appease a higher power. This is another reason why mystics often feel uncomfortable with structured religions, right? And that's one reason why in this setting we often cringe at calling this worship, although other people just call it that because it's just a common term and everybody knows what it is. And I've had outsiders say, worship, why do you call it worship? What are you worshiping? You don't necessarily believe in a higher power. And I'm like, well, I'm worshiping the love that's in community, and I'm fully comfortable with calling it that and saying that's what we're doing here in this spirit. Let's see, where am I at? Oh, number 8, you believe you are a conduit for power, not the source. Mystics possess an understanding that every living thing must come and go, and then in the grand scheme, they're simply one wave in an ocean. It sounds pretty Buddhist to me, and I love the ocean metaphor coming back again. Number 9, you believe love is the source of life, and this one's a strong one for me. The people and experiences that we love in our lives are merely a small reflection of a larger, all-encompassing love. Love is not something that originates in you, rather it is something that flows through you and every other being. And finally, number 10, you don't know everything. Mystics acknowledge that the universe is infinite and mysterious and is far too complex for the human mind to fully comprehend. So there you have it, the 10 telltale signs you might be a mystic. So I ask you, are you a Unitarian Universalist mystic? And I don't know that you have to answer all 10 of them to the positive to be that. So I just want you to ponder that, and I'm going to go back to what we did right before I did the silent meditation rang the gong. We sang a very mystical chant. It's basically saying that we can all envision that the air surrounding us is completely filled with peace and love, as if it were some sort of fragrance or something. And we're mystically saying, when I breathe in, I breathe in peace. And when I breathe out love. It's the same thing as the song, where we're trying to give that love back to the ocean so that it fuller, richer can be. Hopefully by us breathing out love, this space became fuller and richer. So why is this important? Because, folks, we all know this. We live in troubling times, And to me, it's unrelenting love is that feeds our souls. It's where we find the hope and the passion for social justice and to try to make this world better. And it's our yearning for unrelenting love and a belief that everyone else is worthy of having it that drives us. So this Advent season, may we be open to the mystery of unrelenting love. And I'll close with these words from the song. O love that will not let me go, O love, I rest my weary soul in thee. I give thee back the life I owe, that in thy ocean depths its flow may richer, fuller be, that someday morn shall tearless be.